The Wyoming wind carried dust and whispers through the auction yard that September morning, but what it carried most was judgment. Walter Brennan stood at the back of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping the rail as a gray stallion exploded into the ring. The horse moved like bottled lightning, hooves striking sparks against the packed earth, eyes rolling white with fury. 3 handlers struggled with the lead ropes, their boots sliding in the dirt as the animal reared and twisted. A tornado of muscle and rage contained only by fraying nylon and human desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speaker system, fighting to be heard over the chaos. This here's a 5-year-old gray stallion, comes from the Henderson place up north. Strong bloodlines, but he's got some fire in him that needs the right hand. The crowd erupted in laughter, the kind that cuts like barbed wire. Fire was a generous word for what everyone could see. This was a horse that had decided the world was his enemy, and he fought it with every breath. A man in pressed denim and a spotless Stetson called out from the front row. "That ain't fire, Bill. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Might as well send him to the killers and save someone the hospital bills." More laughter rolled through the assembled ranchers and buyers, each one calculating the cost of broken bones against the value of horseflesh. The stallion screamed, a sound that tore through the morning and silenced even the mockery for a heartbeat. In that brief quiet, Walt saw what no one else seemed to notice. The horse wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Walt had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who'd worked too many years in darkness, hauling freight through mountain tunnels where the walls pressed close and the air tasted like coal dust and fear. He'd seen it in his own mirror after Margaret died, when the house became too quiet and every room held the shape of her absence. This horse had been broken by cruelty, not born with it, and somewhere beneath the violence was an animal that simply wanted to survive. The auctioneer tried again, his enthusiasm dimming with each failed attempt to generate interest. "All right, folks, let's start the bidding at $2,000. Silence stretched across the yard, broken only by the stallion's labored breathing and the creak of strained rope. 1,000 then. Still nothing. The handlers exchanged glances, their arms trembling from the effort of holding a creature that outweighed them by half a ton. $500, and that's practically giving him away. Someone near the front muttered that even that was too much for a killer, and the sentiment rippled through the crowd like poison in a well. Walt felt his hand rising before his mind had fully committed to the action. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of diesel fumes and mountain air. 500. Heads turned. The auctioneer squinted toward the back, lifting a hand to shade his eyes against the morning sun. "That you, Walt Brennan?" The surprise in his voice carried clearly through the microphone. Walt nodded once, feeling the weight of every eye in the yard settle on his shoulders. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly uncertain whether to be relieved or concerned. "Well then, do I hear 550? Anyone want to save old Walt here from making a mistake?" The silence that followed had teeth in it. Jack Holloway turned in his seat near the front, his face splitting into a grin that held no warmth. He was younger than Walt by 20 years, with the kind of polish that money could buy and the kind of arrogance that came from never having failed at anything that mattered. "Walt," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone men use when they want everyone to hear them being reasonable. "Walt, you know I respect you. Worked with your generation on the line, learned from the best. But that animal there is dangerous. He's been through 3 facilities, put 2 trainers in the hospital, and near about killed a farrier in Sheridan. You're what, 68? 70? No offense meant, but that horse will put you in the ground." Walt met his gaze across the crowd and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "Maybe he's had reason to be dangerous." Jack's smile thinned. "That's sentimental thinking, and sentiment gets people hurt. The modern approach to horse training is based on science, on understanding the animal's psychology and applying consistent pressure. That horse has proven he can't be rehabilitated through conventional means." Walt shifted his weight, his bad leg aching from standing too long in the cold. Conventional means broke him in the first place. Maybe he needs something different. The auctioneer tapped his microphone, eager to move the sale forward before the crowd got too entertained by the spectacle and forgot to bid on the remaining stock. Going once at 500 to Walt Brennan. Going twice. His gavel cracked against the podium like a gunshot, and the gray stallion flinched at the sound, nearly pulling one of the handlers off his feet. Sold to Walt Brennan for $500. God help you, Walt. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others already swapping predictions about how long before the old man came to his senses or came to harm. Walt made his way down from the rail, each step a negotiation with the knee that had been shattered 30 years ago in a switching yard accident. By the time he reached the collection area, Ruth Kowalski was waiting for him, her arms crossed and her expression somewhere between exasperation and concern. Ruth had run the auction house since before Walt's hair had gone silver, and she'd known him long enough to speak plainly. Walt Brennan, she said without preamble, I've seen you make some questionable decisions in my time, but this might top them all. That animal is genuinely dangerous. He put a man through a fence panel last month. Walt pulled out his checkbook. The leather cover cracked and faded. I heard about that. I also heard the man was using a whip and spurs on a horse that had already been beaten half to death by his previous owner. Ruth's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Even so, you're not a young man anymore, and you live alone out there. If something happens, who's going to find you? Walt signed the check with his careful, precise handwriting, the numbers looking small and almost apologetic in the amount column. $500 was most of what he'd saved from his last pension check. Money that should have gone toward fixing the barn roof or replacing the hot water heater that had been making ominous noises since July. My daughter checks on me, he said quietly, and I'm not planning on dying just yet. Ruth took the check and studied his face for a long moment. Margaret wouldn't want you doing something foolish out of loneliness, Walt. The words hit harder than she probably intended, and Walt looked away, watching as the handlers struggled to load the gray stallion into a livestock trailer. He's going to the killers if I don't take him. Ruth sighed and stamped the bill of sale. Then I guess he's yours. But I'm putting Doc Peterson's number in the paperwork, and you better promise me you'll call him before you do anything stupid with that animal. The trailer barely contained the stallion's fury. Metal boomed and rang as hooves struck the sides, and the whole structure rocked on its wheels. Walt approached slowly, his boots scuffing the gravel deliberately so the horse would hear him coming. Through the ventilation slats, he could see one wild eye, the white showing all around the dark iris. Easy now, Walt murmured, not expecting the horse to understand the words but hoping the tone might penetrate the wall of fear. Easy. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. The eye blinked once, and for just an instant, the battering from inside the trailer paused. Then it resumed, perhaps even more violently than before, as if the horse had decided that gentleness was just another form of trap. Walt understood. Trust, once shattered, didn't reassemble itself with a few soft words. It had to be rebuilt piece by careful piece, and sometimes preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fragments cut your hands while you worked. The drive back to Iron Ridge took 40 minutes on roads that had seen better decades. Walt's truck groaned under the strain of pulling the trailer, its transmission whining in protest on the hills. Behind him, the stallion continued his assault on the metal walls, and more than once Walt checked the rearview mirror to make sure the whole thing hadn't tipped over. The town appeared gradually through the windshield, first the grain elevator rising against the gray sky, then the church steeple, then the scattered buildings of Main Street looking tired and faded in the autumn light. Iron Ridge had been built by the railroad and was dying with it. The depot sat empty now, its windows boarded and its platform cracked by years of freeze and thaw. The houses that lined the residential streets showed varying degrees of surrender, some still maintaining their paint and their dignity, others leaning slightly as if too exhausted to stand fully upright. Walt's property sat on the eastern edge of town where the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel eventually surrendered to sagebrush and prairie grass. 15 acres that he and Margaret had bought 40 years ago with dreams of raising horses and maybe some cattle, dreams that had been postponed year after year as the railroad demanded more hours and more time until retirement arrived and Margaret got sick and the dreams had nowhere left to go. The barn leaned to the south, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. The house was small but solid, white clapboard with green shutters that rattled in the wind. Walt pulled around to the corral, an area he'd reinforced with extra rails last spring in a fit of optimism he couldn't quite explain even to himself. He'd told Nora it was to keep the property value up, but they both knew there was no property value left in Iron Ridge. People were leaving, not arriving. He backed the trailer up to the gate, set the parking brake, and sat for a moment listening to the rage contained in the metal box behind him. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, and his knee throbbed with the promise of rain. At 68, Walt Brennan was not the man he'd been at 40 or even at 50. His strength had limits now. His balance was uncertain on uneven ground, and his bones remembered every old injury with faithful precision. But he'd learned things in those years too. Patience, the value of stillness, the way a soft voice could sometimes penetrate where force only hardened resistance. These were not the skills valued in modern horse training facilities with their round pens and their pressure and release systems and their timelines measured in weeks rather than seasons. These were older skills, the kind that took longer and looked like nothing at all to people who didn't know how to watch. Walt climbed down from the truck cab, every movement deliberate and careful. He opened the corral gate wide, then checked that the water trough was full and the mineral block was accessible. The stallion would need space to decompress, to realize that this place was different from wherever he'd come from. Only then did Walt approach the trailer, moving slowly along its length until he reached the rear doors. The battering from inside had stopped, replaced by a tense silence that felt more dangerous than the violence. Walt unlatched the doors but didn't swing them open. Instead, he stepped back and waited, giving the horse room to make his own choice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a gray nose appeared at the gap, nostrils flaring as they tested the air. The nose withdrew. More silence. Walt remained still, his weight evenly distributed, his breathing slow and steady. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of his neck. A magpie called from the fence line. Somewhere in town, a dog barked 3 times and fell quiet. Finally, with a rush of hooves and a metallic clang, the stallion burst from the trailer like water breaking through a dam. He hit the corral at a gallop, circling the perimeter with his head high and his tail flagged, looking for weakness in the fence or threat in the landscape. Walt watched without moving, letting the horse expend the adrenaline that had been building in his system since the auction. The gray coat was darker with sweat, the muscles beneath it standing out in sharp definition. He was magnificent and broken all at once, power without direction, strength without purpose. After several circuits, the stallion slowed to a trot, then a walk, finally stopping at the far corner of the corral with his hindquarters to Walt and his ears pinned flat against his skull. "You're safe here," Walt said quietly. "I know you don't believe that yet, but it's true." The stallion's ears flicked backward at the sound of his voice, but didn't lift from their hostile position. Walt backed away from the fence, giving the horse space to settle. He closed the trailer, unhitched it from the truck, and drove the truck up to its usual spot beside the shed. His knee buckled slightly as he stepped down, and he had to catch himself on the door frame. The movement sent a spike of pain through his leg that took his breath away and brought tears to his eyes. He stood there for a moment, waiting for it to pass, and tried not to think about what Jack Holloway had said at the auction. Tried not to think about how much harder this would be than he'd imagined. The screen door banged, and Walt looked up to see Nora's car pulling into the driveway. His daughter emerged with the purposeful stride of someone who'd heard news and arrived to prevent disaster. She was dressed in her work scrubs, which meant she'd come straight from the hospital during her lunch break, which meant Ruth Kowalski had already called her. Nora had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, a combination that had served her well through nursing school and single motherhood, but sometimes made conversations with her feel like treaty negotiations. "Dad," she said without preamble. "Please tell me Ruth was joking." Walt leaned against the truck and tried to look more steady than he felt. She probably wasn't. Nora stopped a few feet away and put her hands on her hips, a gesture so reminiscent of Margaret that Walt's chest tightened. You bought an untamable horse. At 68. With a bad knee and no help and $500 you needed for the furnace repair. Walt glanced toward the corral where the gray stallion stood rigid and watchful in the corner. He's not untamable. He's scared. Nora followed his gaze and her expression shifted from anger to something closer to grief. Dad, you can't save everything that's broken. I know you're lonely. I know you miss Mom. But this is dangerous, and I can't lose you too. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw and painful in their accuracy. Walt opened his mouth to argue, to explain that this wasn't about Margaret or loneliness or trying to fill empty spaces in his life. But maybe it was. Maybe he'd seen himself in that terrified animal and couldn't walk away. Maybe $500 and a possibly futile gesture was better than another year of waiting for life to surprise him with purpose. I'll be careful, he said finally. Nora shook her head, recognizing the sound of a man who'd already made up his mind. Fine, but I'm calling Doc Peterson, and you're going to let him look at that animal before you do anything stupid. And I'm bringing Finn out here this weekend, because maybe a 9-year-old will talk some sense into you since I clearly can't. She walked back to her car, anger and love moving through her shoulders in equal measure. The engine started, gravel crunched, and then she was gone, leaving Walt alone with his new responsibility and the afternoon spreading out before him like a challenge he didn't yet know how to meet. The first 3 days were a study in distance. Walt rose before dawn each morning, brewed coffee so strong it could strip paint, and walked out to the corral where the gray stallion stood like a monument to mistrust. The horse had claimed the northwest corner as his territory, positioning himself so he could see both the barn and the house, his body angled to present his hindquarters to any approach. Walt didn't push. He simply stood on the opposite side of the fence, holding his steaming mug, and watched the sky change colors while the stallion watched him. On the first morning, the horse remained rigid for the entire hour Walt spent there. Not a muscle relaxing, not an ear softening. On the second morning, one ear rotated forward for perhaps 10 seconds before snapping back. On the third morning, the stallion took 3 steps closer to the water trough while Walt was present. A concession so small it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Walt paid attention. He'd learned in 40 years of railroad work that the difference between a train staying on the tracks and a derailment often came down to noticing a single bolt that had worked itself loose. One small thing among thousands that everyone else walked past without seeing. Doc Peterson arrived on the 4th day, driving his battered veterinary truck up the gravel drive with the unhurried pace of a man who'd made this trip 1,000 times before. He was Walt's age, maybe a year or 2 older, with silver hair that stuck up in all directions and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking into the sun while working on animals in open fields. He climbed out of the truck carrying his worn medical bag and stood for a moment, assessing the gray stallion with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every variation of horse temperament the world could produce. That's a pretty animal, Doc said without inflection. Also looks like he'd enjoy stomping me into the dirt. Walt handed him a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought out. Ruth said he put someone through a fence. Doc sipped the coffee and nodded slowly. Heard about that. Also heard about the whip marks on his flanks and the rope burns on his legs. Henderson bought him from a ranch up in Montana where they were using old-style braking methods, the kind where you tie a horse down and wait for his spirit to crack. Only this one spirit didn't crack. It just turned into something else. They stood together watching the stallion, who had pressed himself into the corner even tighter at the arrival of a stranger. His nostrils flared wide, testing the air for threat. His entire body coiled like a spring under dangerous tension. "What do you need from me, Walt?" Doc asked. Walt set down his cup on the fence post. "I need to know if he's sound. If there's injuries I should know about. If there's pain making him this way." Doc nodded and set down his own cup. "Then we're going to need to get close to him, which means we're probably going to need sedation, which means he's going to learn that people with needles are exactly as dangerous as he thinks they are." Walt had anticipated this problem. He'd spent the past 3 nights reading everything he could find about trauma in horses, about building trust with animals that had been systematically taught that humans meant pain. Most of the advice was useless, written by people who had facility horses and round pens and all the time in the world. But he'd found one article written by a woman who'd worked with mustangs fresh off the range that talked about breathing, about how horses are prey animals tuned to the respiration of everything around them, how a predator's breathing changes before an attack, how a horse can hear the difference between calm and threat in the rhythm of your lungs. What if we don't sedate him, Walt said. What if we just wait? Doc raised his eyebrows. Wait for what? For him to invite me in for tea and a medical examination? Walt shook his head. Wait for him to get curious. Horses are curious by nature. Right now his fear is louder than his curiosity, but eventually, if we're boring enough, the curiosity might get louder. Doc studied Walt's face for a long moment, then looked back at the stallion. That could take days, could take weeks. I've got other calls to make, Walt. I can't sit in your pasture until that animal decides to play nice. You go make your calls, Walt said. Come back this evening. If he's not ready, you come back tomorrow evening. Keep coming back until he is. Doc picked up his coffee cup and drained it, then set it back down with a decisive clink. You're either the most patient man I've ever met or the most foolish. Margaret used to say the same thing, Walt replied. Doc laughed, a short bark that made the stallion's ears pin flat. All right, I'll play it your way. But if that animal charges the fence, I'm not too old to run. After Doc left, Walt dragged a hay bale to the fence line and sat down on it. His knee protested the position, sending sharp complaints up into his hip, but he ignored it. The stallion glared at him from across the corral, tail swishing in agitation. Walt simply sat. He didn't look directly at the horse, instead keeping his gaze soft and unfocused on the middle distance. He regulated his breathing, making it deep and slow, the kind of breathing he'd learned from Tommy Crowflies, an elder he'd worked with back in the 70s on a track repair crew outside of Billings. Tommy had taught him things the railroad manual never mentioned. How to read the land by the way grass bent in the wind. How to tell if a storm was coming by the behavior of ravens. How to calm a spooked animal with nothing but your presence and your breath. Tommy had learned these things from his grandfather, who had learned them from his grandfather, knowledge passed down through generations who had lived alongside horses long before the railroad came, before fences divided the prairie into pieces, before anyone thought to call an animal untameable just because it refused to be broken. Walt sat on that hay bale for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders and making him drowsy. His knee went from aching to numb. Twice he had to shift position to keep his leg from falling asleep completely. The stallion remained in his corner, but gradually the rigid tension in his body began to ease. His head lowered slightly, one hind leg cocked in a subtle shift toward rest. His ears, while not friendly, were no longer pinned aggressively flat. They swiveled occasionally, tracking sounds from the road, from the house, from Walt's quiet breathing. Around noon, Nora's car appeared again, and this time Finn tumbled out before the vehicle had fully stopped. The boy was all limbs and energy, 9 years old with his mother's dark eyes and a gap in his front teeth from a recent encounter with a baseball. He spotted Walt by the corral and came running, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Grandpa, Mom says you bought a crazy horse. Can I see him? Is he really dangerous? Does he have a name yet? Walt stood slowly, his knee crackling like breaking ice, and put a hand on Finn's shoulder to slow him down. He's not crazy, he said quietly. He's scared, and we need to be calm around him. Can you do that? Finn nodded, his excitement dimming but not extinguishing. I can be calm. I'm very good at calm. Nora approached more slowly, carrying a grocery bag. I brought you some actual food since I know you've been living on coffee and stubbornness. She set the bag on the porch steps and came to stand beside them at the fence. The three of them stood there together, looking at the gray stallion who was now watching them with what might have been curiosity rather than pure hostility. He's beautiful, Finn whispered, like a ghost horse, like something from a story. What are you going to call him? Walt had been thinking about this. The horse had been called various things at the auction, none of them names, just descriptions of his temperament and his unsuitability for civilized use. He needed a name that acknowledged what he was without defining him by it. Storm, Walt said. His name is Storm. Finn considered this, tilting his head. Because he's gray like storm clouds? Walt shook his head. Because he's been through one. And because maybe he's got one still inside him. But storms pass. They always do. Nora made a sound that might have been approval or might have been resignation. She put her hand on the fence rail, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm. Dad, I talked to Jack Holloway. He called me at work. Walt's jaw tightened. Did he now? She nodded. He said he's genuinely concerned about your safety. He offered to take the horse off your hands. Said he'd even give you your 500 back. Said his facility has the equipment to handle difficult animals. Walt knew exactly what equipment Jack meant. Stocks to hold a horse immobile. Whips to teach obedience. Spurs to demand submission. The modern efficient way to break an animal's will in the name of making it useful. That's generous of him, Walt said carefully. But Storm's not going anywhere. Nora turned to face him directly, and in her expression Walt saw the fear she'd been trying to hide behind practicality. Mom died because neither of you wanted to admit she needed more help than you could give her at home. Don't do that again. Don't let pride or loneliness or whatever this is keep you from seeing when something is beyond what you can handle. The words hit like a fist to the chest. Margaret had fought to stay home through the worst of the cancer, and Walt had supported that choice even when the nurses suggested hospice care, even when the pain got so bad she couldn't sleep, even when every moment became a battle neither of them knew how to win. She died in their bed with Walt holding her hand, and he'd never been certain if he'd honored her wishes, or simply been too afraid to let her go somewhere he couldn't follow. This is different, Walt said, his voice rough. Nora, I hear you. I do. But this isn't about replacing Mom or filling empty time. This horse and we understand something about each other. We've both been written off. We're both supposed to accept that our useful days are behind us. I'm not ready to accept that. Not yet. Nora's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Then promise me you'll be smart about this. Promise me you'll ask for help when you need it. Promise me you won't end up in the hospital or worse because you were too stubborn to admit you couldn't do something alone. I promise, Walt said, and he meant it. Finn had been watching this exchange with the solemn attention children bring to adult conversations they don't fully understand but know are important. He reached out and took his grandfather's hand, his small fingers warm and slightly sticky from the granola bar he'd eaten in the car. I'll help you, Grandpa. I'm not very strong, but I'm a good helper. Mom says so. Walt squeezed his hand gently. I know you are, buddy. Maybe this weekend you can come out and we'll work with Storm together. Would you like that? Finn's face lit up with such pure joy that both adults had to smile despite the tension still hanging in the air. Really? I can help train him? Walt nodded. You can help me be patient. That's the most important job there is. After Nora and Finn left, Walt returned to his hay bale. The afternoon stretched long and golden, autumn light pouring across the prairie like honey. Storm had moved slightly closer to the center of the corral, no longer pressed into the corner. His head was up but relaxed, his ears rotating independently as they tracked the sounds of Walt's breathing, the distant traffic on the highway, the wind moving through the dried grass. They existed in the same space without conflict, and that was enough for now. Doc Peterson returned as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked almost too vivid to be real. He parked his truck and walked to the fence where Walt still sat, now wrapped in an old canvas coat against the evening chill. The stallion had moved to the water trough and was drinking, his eyes on Doc but his body language more wary than aggressive. Well, Doc said quietly, that's progress. Walt stood, his knees screaming in protest, and stamped his feet to get blood flowing again. He's thinking about trusting. That's different from actually trusting, but it's a start. They stood together in the fading light, two old men watching a traumatized horse drink water like it was the most important thing in the world. Tomorrow I'll try to get closer, Walt said. Maybe put some grain in a bucket and see if hunger is stronger than fear. Doc nodded. And if it's not? Then we wait longer, Walt replied. We've got all the time there is. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, the way it does in high country autumn. Walt fed Storm by tossing flakes of hay over the fence rather than entering the corral, respecting the boundary the horse had established. Storm waited until Walt had returned to the house before approaching the hay, but he approached it. Small victories, Tommy Crowflies had once said, are what the world is actually made of. People just don't notice them because they're too busy looking for big ones. Inside the house, Walt heated a can of soup Nora had brought and ate it standing at the kitchen sink, too tired to bother with sitting down. The kitchen still held Margaret's touches everywhere. Her recipe cards in the drawer, her handwriting on the calendar from 2 years ago that he'd never had the heart to replace. Her favorite coffee mug hanging on its hook. He'd been living in a museum of her memory, carefully preserving everything exactly as she'd left it, because changing anything felt like erasing her. But looking out the window at the dark shape of the horse moving through the corral, Walt felt something shift. Margaret would have liked Storm. She would have understood exactly why Walt couldn't leave him at that auction. She would have called him a fool and helped him anyway, the way she always had. That night Walt dreamed he was back on the railroad, but the tracks were broken and twisted, leading nowhere. He walked along them trying to find the section that had derailed, but every time he got close, the broken part moved further ahead. He woke in darkness with his heart pounding and his knee throbbing, and lay there listening to the house settle around him. Through the window he could see the corral, and in the starlight he could just make out Storm's pale form. The horse was lying down, actually sleeping, trusting enough in this new place to let his guard drop during the vulnerable hours of night. Walt watched until his own breathing slowed and matched the rhythm of rest, then closed his eyes and slept without dreaming until dawn. The following days established a pattern. Walt would rise early, make his coffee, and go sit by the corral. Storm would watch from a distance that gradually decreased. On the 5th day, the horse came within 20 feet of where Walt sat. On the 6th day, he came within 10. On the 7th day, Storm approached the fence directly across from Walt's position and stood there, his large dark eyes fixed on the old man's face with an intensity that felt like a question being asked in a language Walt was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, Walt entered the corral for the first time. He didn't approach Storm, simply walked to the center of the space, set down a bucket of grain mixed with molasses, and walked back out. Storm waited until Walt had moved away from the gate before approaching the bucket. He sniffed it suspiciously, backed away, approached again, then finally lowered his head and ate. His ears remained alert, tracking Walt's every movement, ready to flee or fight if the situation changed. But he ate. The next day, Walt stayed inside the corral while Storm ate, standing motionless at the fence, while the horse consumed his grain from the bucket, placed 15 feet away. Finn came out on Saturday morning as promised, and Walt taught him the breathing technique Tommy Crowflies had taught him decades ago. They sat together on the hay bale, grandfather and grandson, breathing in slow, steady rhythms while Storm watched them with what might have been amusement. "Does it really work, Grandpa?" Finn whispered. Walt nodded. "It works because it changes you, not the horse. When you're calm, really calm, not just pretending, the horse can feel it. They're better at reading us than we are at reading them." Finn concentrated fiercely, his small chest rising and falling with exaggerated slowness. Storm took 3 steps closer than he ever had before. By the end of October, Walt could stand in the corral with Storm for extended periods without the horse showing signs of stress. They existed in proximity, sharing space, each aware of the other but not forcing interaction. Walt noticed things about Storm that no one at the auction had probably cared enough to see. The way his left ear had a small notch in it, probably from a fight or an accident. The way he preferred to drink from the north side of the water trough where the afternoon sun warmed the water slightly. The way he would sometimes stand with his eyes half closed, facing into the wind, as if remembering something from before the cruelty found him. Doc Peterson came by twice a week now, not always to try to examine Storm, sometimes just to sit with Walt and talk about nothing in particular. On one of these visits, as they watched Storm roll in the dust, coating his gray coat in brown powder, Doc said something that had clearly been on his mind for a while. "You know, people are talking, Walt, saying you're wasting your time, saying that horse will never be safe to handle." Walt picked up a piece of straw and twirled it between his fingers. "People talked when I married Margaret too. Said she was too educated for a railroad man. Said it wouldn't last. We had 43 years before the cancer took her." Doc smiled. "Fair point. But this is different. You can't make a horse love you through sheer determination. Walt shook his head. I'm not trying to make him love me. I'm trying to show him that not everyone is going to hurt him. If he never lets me touch him, that's fine. At least he'll have a place where he can eat and sleep without fear. That counts for something. Doc stood to leave, then paused with his hand on the fence rail. You're a good man, Walt Brennan. This world needs more people willing to give broken things a chance to heal, even when there's no guarantee they will. After Doc left, Walt approached the grain bucket as he did every day. But this time Storm didn't move away. He stayed at the far side of the corral, watching, his body tense but not panicked. Walt set down the bucket and, instead of leaving immediately, stood quietly with his hands at his sides. He began to hum, an old railroad song that had no words, just a melody that spoke of distance and longing and the rhythm of wheels on tracks. Storm's ears pricked forward. He took one step toward Walt, then another. The space between them collapsed slowly, measured in heartbeats and held breath. When only 6 feet separated them, Storm stopped. Walt stopped humming but continued to breathe, slow and steady. They stood like that as the afternoon sun stretched their shadows long across the dirt, man and horse, damaged and healing, together in the imperfect present moment. November brought the first serious cold. Ice formed in the water trough overnight, and Walt had to break it each morning with a rubber mallet. His knee ached constantly now, the old injury awakened by the cold and the hours spent standing in the corral. Some mornings it took him 20 minutes to get out of bed, his joints protesting every movement. But he kept to his routine. Coffee, corral, patience. Storm's coat had grown thicker, preparing for winter, making him look larger and somehow less defined, as if the cold was blurring his edges and softening the sharp lines of trauma that had defined him. Walt built a windbreak on the north side of the corral using old pallets and tarps, creating a sheltered area where Storm could escape the worst of the wind. The horse watched this construction with obvious suspicion, but after a particularly bitter night when the temperature dropped below freezing, Walt found him standing in the protected corner, his breath fogging the air, his expression almost peaceful. Progress appeared in these small surrenders, these tiny acknowledgments that maybe, just possibly, this human was different from the others. The town continued to watch and whisper. Walt heard the stories third hand, through Nora or Doc or Ruth Kowalski when he went to the feed store. Jack Holloway had apparently made his opinion known at the Cattlemen's Association meeting, stating that what Walt was doing was dangerous not just to himself but to the reputation of proper horse training. He'd cited statistics about injury rates and talked about the importance of establishing dominance early in the training process. Several members had agreed with him. A few had defended Walt's right to handle his own horse however he saw fit. The meeting had apparently gotten heated enough that the president had to call for order and change the subject. Walt tried not to let it bother him. He'd never been one to court public opinion or seek validation from committees. But he'd also lived his whole life in Iron Ridge, had worked alongside many of these men on railroad crews and volunteer fire department shifts and town cleanup days. Their judgment stung more than he wanted to admit. Only Storm seemed immune to the weight of reputation and community standards. He simply existed, day by day, gradually learning that this particular patch of earth was safe, that this particular human wouldn't raise a hand in anger, that fear could loosen its grip one careful breath at a time. On Thanksgiving Day, Nora brought dinner to Walt's house rather than making him come to her apartment in town. She arrived with Finn and enough food for a small army, turkey and mashed potatoes and green bean casserole and 3 kinds of pie. They ate at the kitchen table that had been too large for just Walt since Margaret died, and for the first time in 2 years the house felt like it had people in it rather than just one person existing in rooms that remembered better days. After dinner, Finn asked if he could go see Storm, and Walt bundled him into his spare coat and they walked out to the corral together. Storm was standing in his windbreak, his breath steaming in the cold air. When he saw Finn, his ears came forward with what looked like recognition. The boy had been visiting every weekend, always quiet, always respectful of Storm's space, and the horse had apparently decided that this small human was safe. Finn climbed carefully onto the fence rail and began to sing, a song he'd learned in school about a river finding its way to the sea. His voice was high and slightly off-key, but it carried across the corral with the purity of something offered without expectation of return. Storm's head lowered slightly, and he took several steps closer to the fence than he'd ever come when humans were present. Walt watched his grandson sing to the traumatized horse and felt something crack open in his chest, some sealed chamber of grief he hadn't known he was carrying. Margaret would have loved this moment. She would have stood right here with her hand in his, watching their grandson bridge the gap between fear and trust with nothing but his voice and his young faith that things could heal. The loss of her hit Walt fresh and sharp, as it sometimes still did in unexpected moments, but underneath the loss was something else. Gratitude that he'd had her at all. Gratitude that she'd left him Nora and through Nora had given him Finn. Gratitude that he was still here, still capable of bearing witness to small miracles on cold November afternoons. That night, after Nora and Finn had gone home with their containers of leftovers and their promises to return soon, Walt sat in his darkened living room and allowed himself to cry. He cried for Margaret, for the years he'd had with her and the years he'd never have. He cried for Storm and whatever horrors had taught him to meet the world with teeth and hooves. He cried for himself, for the loneliness of the past 2 years, for the way age had crept up on him and stolen his certainty that he knew how to navigate the world. And then he dried his eyes, made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table planning the next phase of Storm's rehabilitation. Grief and hope could exist in the same heart. He was learning that. Maybe Storm was learning it too. December came hard and fast, bringing snow that fell in thick curtains and transformed Iron Ridge into something clean and temporarily beautiful. The roads became treacherous, and Doc Peterson's visits became less frequent. Walt didn't mind. He and Storm had moved past needing witnesses to their progress. The horse would now eat while Walt stood inside the corral, would drink from the trough even when Walt was nearby, would sometimes approach to within a few feet of where Walt stood before his nerve would fail and he'd retreat to his safe distance. These were not the accomplishments that would impress anyone at the Cattlemen's Association, but they were everything to Walt. One morning, after a night of heavy snow, Walt trudged out to the corral to find that the windbreak had partially collapsed under the weight of ice and wind. Storm was standing pressed against the remaining section, shivering despite his thick winter coat. Walt's first thought was to go back for tools and materials to repair the structure, but something stopped him. This was an opportunity. Storm needed help, and Walt was the only one who could provide it. The question was whether the horse's need would outweigh his fear. Walt approached slowly, carrying an armload of hay. He placed it in the sheltered corner, then walked back out to drag one of the fallen pallets into position. Storm watched but didn't flee. Walt worked steadily, his hands clumsy in thick gloves, his knees screaming with every awkward movement in the deep snow. He repositioned the pallets, secured the tarp, created a barrier against the wind that was currently cutting across the corral like a knife. It took him nearly an hour, and by the end his clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his knee had progressed from screaming to a dull roar that promised serious pain later. When he finished, Walt stepped back and leaned against the fence to catch his breath. Storm had remained in place the entire time, watching every movement, and now he did something he'd never done before. He walked directly toward Walt, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, and stopped within arm's reach. His breath came in visible clouds that mingled with Walt's. His dark eyes, no longer showing the whites in panic, studied the old man's face with an expression that looked almost like understanding. Walt remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as Storm stretched his neck forward and touched his muzzle to Walt's chest, right over his heart. The contact lasted only a second before Storm backed away, but that second contained everything Walt had been working toward. Not dominance or control or mastery, but simple acknowledgement between two beings that they'd been seen by each other. Walt's eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with the cold wind. "Thank you," he whispered. Storm blew out a breath that might have been answer or might have been coincidence, then moved into the repaired windbreak and began to eat the hay Walt had provided. The moment was over, but it had happened. That was what mattered. Winter deepened its grip on Iron Ridge, and with it came the kind of cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. Walt's morning routine became more arduous as ice made every surface treacherous, and his damaged knee protested each step with increasing vehemence. Some mornings he had to use a walking stick to make it from the house to the corral, a concession to age that he resented but couldn't deny. Storm seemed to sense these difficult mornings, watching Walt's slow progress with an attention that felt less like wariness and more like concern. The touch that had happened after the windbreak repair had not been repeated, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Storm no longer fled when Walt entered the corral. He would continue whatever he was doing, eating or drinking or simply standing, while Walt moved about his business of distributing hay or checking the fence line for damage. They shared the space now as barn mates rather than captor and captive. It wasn't everything Walt had hoped for, but it was far more than anyone else had predicted. Doc Peterson managed to visit during a break in the weather, his truck churning through snowdrifts that had piled waist-high along the driveway. He brought supplies, grain and mineral supplements, and a bottle of liniment for Walt's knee that he didn't ask about, but simply left on the kitchen table with a meaningful look. They stood together at the fence, watching Storm nose through the snow to find the hay underneath. The horse paused in his foraging to look at them, then returned to his work without alarm. "I'll be damned," Doc said quietly. "He's actually settled." Walt nodded, keeping his hands deep in his coat pockets against the cold. "He's starting to understand this is home." Doc turned to study Walt's face, noting the lines that had deepened around his eyes, the way he was favoring his left leg. "And how are you holding up?" Walt shrugged, the gesture stiff in his heavy coat. "I've been better. I've been worse. The knee's talking to me more than I'd like, but it's manageable." Doc made a sound that suggested he didn't entirely believe this but wouldn't push. "You planning to try any actual training, or is the goal just to give him a comfortable retirement?" The question had been nagging at Walt for weeks. Storm had learned to trust enough to coexist peacefully, but that was a far cry from being handleable, rideable, or useful in any conventional sense. Jack Holloway's words from the auction echoed sometimes in Walt's mind during the long cold nights. "That horse will never be safe." Most people would have agreed with that assessment by now. Storm would tolerate human presence but still shied away from direct contact. He'd never allowed Walt to put a hand on him, never mind a halter or a rope. By any practical measure, the project was stalled. "I don't know yet," Walt admitted. "He's come so far from where he was. Pushing him too hard now might undo all of it." Doc nodded slowly. "That's wise thinking. But Walt, I've got to ask, what's the end game here? Are you content to just feed him for however many years you've both got left? Because that's expensive, and your pension isn't going to stretch forever." Walt had been avoiding these calculations, but the numbers were inescapable. Feed costs, veterinary bills, fence repairs, the price of keeping even a single horse added up faster than his fixed income could comfortably absorb. He'd already dipped into the small savings Margaret had insisted they maintain for emergencies. That fund was dwindling. "I've been thinking about that," Walt said. "Spring's coming eventually. When it does, I might start offering trail rides or lessons like that rancher suggested. Storm's not ready for that now, but maybe by summer." Doc looked skeptical but didn't voice it. Instead, he clapped Walt on the shoulder and said, "Well, you've surprised people before. Just take care of yourself while you're taking care of him." After Doc left, Walt stood alone in the cold, watching his breath form clouds in the air. The truth was he didn't have a plan beyond the next day, the next week, the next small increment of progress. He'd spent 40 years on the railroad working according to schedules and timetables and strict protocols. This was different. This required faith in a process that had no guaranteed endpoint. That night, the temperature plummeted to 10 below zero. Walt woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind howling around the house like something alive and angry. He pulled on his warmest clothes and trudged out to check on Storm, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness thick with blowing snow. The windbreak was holding, but barely. Storm was huddled in the corner, his body lowered against the wind, ice forming on his whiskers and eyelashes. Walt's heart clenched at the sight. The barn was warmer, but getting Storm into it would require a level of trust they hadn't yet achieved. He made a decision that was probably foolish but felt necessary. He dragged hay bales to create a better barrier, working in the freezing wind until his fingers went numb inside his gloves. Then he sat down in the sheltered corner he'd created, his back against the hay, and simply stayed. If Storm wouldn't come to the barn, Walt would bring whatever warmth and comfort he could out here. The horse watched this strange behavior with evident confusion. Here was the human, sitting in the snow in the middle of the night, making no demands, simply present. Hours passed. Walt's body ached with cold despite his layers. His knee felt like someone was driving nails through it. He dozed fitfully, jerking awake whenever the wind gusted hard enough to shake the structure. At some point near dawn, he felt warmth against his side and opened his eyes to find Storm standing directly beside him, close enough that Walt could feel heat radiating from the horse's body. Storm wasn't touching him, maintaining a careful inch of separation, but he'd positioned himself to act as a windbreak, using his own bulk to shield the old man from the worst of the cold. Walt didn't move. He barely breathed. They stayed like that as the sky gradually lightened from black to gray, as the wind finally began to ease, as the impossible cold retreated to merely miserable. When full light came, Storm stepped away and shook himself, snow flying from his coat in a glittering cloud. He walked to his hay pile and began to eat as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. The horse had chosen to protect the human. After all the ways humans had hurt him, Storm had looked at Walt's suffering in the cold and decided to offer what help he could. Walt managed to stand, his body screaming in protest, and made his slow, painful way back to the house. He ran a hot bath and sat in it until feeling returned to his extremities, until the shaking stopped, until he could think clearly again about what had just occurred. Storm had made a choice, not out of fear or conditioning or trained response, but out of something that looked remarkably like compassion. Walt understood then that whatever happened next, whether Storm ever allowed himself to be ridden or trained in any conventional sense, the horse had already proven something important. His spirit hadn't been destroyed by the cruelty he'd endured. Underneath the trauma and the defensive aggression was an animal capable of kindness. Nora discovered what had happened when she called that afternoon for their daily check-in. Walt tried to downplay it, but she heard the exhaustion in his voice and arrived within the hour, leaving work early and driving through road conditions that were still dangerous. She found him in bed, something he never did during daylight hours, his face flushed with fever. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "What did you do?" Walt tried to sit up and failed. "I stayed with Storm during the cold snap. I'm fine, just tired." Nora put her hand on his forehead and swore under her breath. "You're burning up. We're going to the hospital." The argument that followed was brief because Walt genuinely didn't have the strength to sustain it. Nora called her neighbor to watch Finn, then helped her father to the car, supporting most of his weight as his knee buckled repeatedly. The drive to the county hospital took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Walt drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Nora's worried voice on the phone, of the hum of the car heater, of the persistent ache that had spread from his knee through his entire body. At the emergency room, they diagnosed pneumonia and severe inflammation in his knee joint. The doctor, a young woman who looked barely old enough to be out of medical school, spoke to Nora rather than to Walt. "He needs to be admitted. The pneumonia is serious at his age, and that knee needs intervention. We're looking at several days minimum." Walt tried to protest from his bed in the examination room. "I can't stay. I have a horse that needs care." The doctor gave him a look that suggested she'd heard many similar objections from elderly patients who refused to acknowledge their limitations. "Mr. Brennan, if you don't stay, the pneumonia could kill you. The knee could develop sepsis. Whatever arrangements you need to make for your horse, make them, because you're not leaving this hospital until we've got both conditions under control." Nora squeezed his hand, her face pale with fear she was trying to hide. "I'll take care of Storm, Dad. I'll go out twice a day. I'll make sure he has food and water. Just focus on getting better." Walt spent 3 days in the hospital bed, hooked to 4 antibiotics and undergoing treatment that involved draining fluid from his knee and injecting it with corticosteroids that burned like fire. He was a terrible patient, constantly asking about Storm, refusing to rest properly, trying to discharge himself against medical advice. The nurses learned to be firm with him, and one older nurse who reminded him painfully of Margaret finally sat down beside his bed and spoke to him the way you'd speak to a frightened child. "Mr. Brennan, that horse survived before you found him. He'll survive a few days without you. But your daughter won't survive losing you, and your grandson needs his grandpa. So stop fighting us and let your body heal." The words penetrated his stubborn resistance. Walt finally surrendered to the treatment, to the rest, to the forced acknowledgement that his body had limits he'd been ignoring. Nora visited every evening after work, sometimes bringing Finn, who would sit quietly by the bed and tell him about school, about his friends, about the book he was reading. She reported on Storm faithfully. The horse was eating, drinking, seemed stressed by Walt's absence but wasn't reverting to his previous aggressive behavior. She'd hired a local high school kid to help her with the feeding, a boy who moved slowly and spoke softly and seemed to have a natural ease around animals. Storm tolerated him at a distance. On the fourth day, Walt was finally discharged with a bag full of medications and strict instructions about rest and physical therapy. Nora drove him home in silence, her hands tight on the steering wheel. When they pulled into the driveway, Walt could see Storm at the far end of the corral, his head up and alert. The moment Walt emerged from the car, moving slowly with his cane, Storm began to pace the fence line, a behavior Walt had never seen from him before. The horse was agitated, clearly disturbed by the absence and now the return. Walt made his way to the fence, every step an effort, and leaned heavily against the rail. "I'm sorry, boy," Walt said quietly. "I didn't mean to leave you." Storm approached closer than he ever had voluntarily, stopping just a few feet away. His nostrils flared, reading Walt's scent, detecting the hospital smells, the medication, the changes illness had wrought. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then Storm did something that made Walt's throat tighten with emotion. He stretched his neck across the remaining distance and pressed his muzzle to Walt's outstretched hand, holding the contact for 3 full seconds before withdrawing. Nora had come to stand beside her father, and she witnessed this interaction with tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered, "he was worried about you." Walt nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The horse that everyone had called Untameable, that had been deemed too dangerous for human contact, had been worried about an old man who'd shown him kindness. The implications of this were staggering. It meant Storm was capable not just of learning to tolerate humans, but of forming actual attachment. It meant the abuse and trauma hadn't destroyed his ability to care. It meant there was hope for healing that went deeper than mere behavior modification. That night, Nora insisted on staying over, sleeping on the couch so she could help Walt with the medication schedule and make sure he didn't overexert himself. They sat together at the kitchen table after she'd made dinner, something simple but nourishing that Walt's recovering body needed. She'd been quiet all evening, clearly working up to saying something difficult. Finally, as Walt was finishing his meal, she spoke. "Dad, I need you to really hear what I'm about to say. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you, you can't do this alone. You nearly died out there. The pneumonia was serious. The doctor said another day and you might have been in ICU. You can't keep pushing yourself this hard." Walt set down his fork and looked at his daughter's face, seeing the fear and love warring there. "I know," he said simply. "I know I can't do it alone." Nora blinked, clearly surprised by his ready agreement. "So what are you going to do?" Walt considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone that needed examining from all angles. "I'm going to ask for help. That kid you hired to help with feeding, what's his name?" "Jamie," Nora said. "Jamie Torres. He's 16, works part-time at the feed store. He was really gentle with Storm. I was impressed." Walt nodded slowly. "Think he'd be interested in learning about horse rehabilitation? I could pay him something, not much, but something. And he'd be learning skills that could serve him well if he wants to work with animals." Nora's expression shifted from fear to cautious optimism. "You'd really do that? Bring someone else in to help?" Walt smiled faintly. "Your mother always said my stubborn independence would be the death of me. I'd rather prove her wrong, even if it's too late for her to see it." They spent the next hour making plans. Nora would talk to Jamie and his parents, explain the situation, see if the arrangement would work. In the meantime, she'd continue coming out daily until Walt was stronger. Doc Peterson would be consulted about a long-term care plan for both Walt and Storm. And if Walt's health continued to be unstable, they'd need to have serious conversations about whether keeping Storm was sustainable. Walt lay in bed that night, listening to Nora's soft snoring from the living room, and thought about sustainability, about what could be maintained over time versus what burned hot and bright and then collapsed. His project with Storm had nearly cost him his life. That was undeniable. But it had also given him something to wake up for, a purpose that extended beyond maintaining his own existence. The question was whether those two things could be balanced, whether he could continue helping Storm heal without destroying himself in the process. He didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time since Margaret's death, he was engaged enough with living to care about finding it. The following week brought gradual improvement. Walt regained his strength slowly, taking the medications religiously, resting when his body demanded it rather than pushing through exhaustion. Jamie Torres came by to meet him formally, a lanky teenager with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a quiet intensity that reminded Walt of himself at that age. The boy had grown up in town, was saving money for college, and confessed that he'd always loved horses but his family couldn't afford to own one. Working with Storm, even a damaged Storm, felt like a gift rather than a job. Walt watched Jamie interact with the horse from his position at the fence and was impressed by the boy's instincts. He didn't push, didn't crowd, didn't make assumptions about what Storm could tolerate. He simply went about the work of feeding and watering with calm efficiency, speaking to the horse in low tones that carried respect rather than dominance. Storm, for his part, seemed to accept Jamie's presence as an extension of Walt's, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply neutral. It was enough. By late January, Walt was well enough to resume light activity in the corral. He couldn't do the heavy work anymore, that fell to Jamie now, but he could stand with Storm, could continue the slow, patient process of building trust. The horse seemed to understand that Walt was diminished, that the old man moved more carefully now, and he adjusted his own behavior accordingly. He came closer with less hesitation. He allowed Walt to stand near him while he ate. Once, on a particularly cold morning, he allowed Walt's hand to rest on his shoulder for perhaps 5 seconds before stepping away. These moments felt like miracles, small and quiet and easily missed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. February brought Valentine's Day, a holiday that had always been Walt and Margaret's. They'd made a tradition of it, nothing fancy, just a nice dinner and the exchange of cards with handwritten messages that said all the things they sometimes forgot to say in the daily routine of living. This was the third Valentine's Day without her, and Walt had dreaded its approach. But Finn had other ideas. The boy arrived in the afternoon with construction paper and markers and glitter glue, and announced that they were making valentines for everyone they loved, including Storm. They sat at the kitchen table, the old man and the young boy, cutting red hearts and decorating them with increasingly elaborate designs. Finn chattered about his class party, about the girl he liked who didn't know he existed, about his hope that maybe this year she'd notice him. Walt listened and offered what wisdom he could about patience and kindness and the importance of showing people who you really are rather than who you think they want you to be. When they finished, Finn had made cards for his mother, his teacher, his best friend, and Storm. Walt had made one, somewhat shakily, for Margaret's grave. They would visit the cemetery later, but first they brought Storm's valentine to the fence. The card proclaimed in Finn's careful printing that Storm was brave and strong and loved. They attached it to the fence post with a clothespin and stepped back. Storm approached, drawn by curiosity, and sniffed the paper carefully. A gust of wind caught it and the card fluttered, which caused Storm to startle backward. But then he approached again, more carefully this time, and touched his nose to the red heart Finn had drawn. The boy laughed with pure delight, and Storm's ears pricked forward at the sound. For just a moment, the traumatized horse and the innocent child looked at each other with mutual curiosity, and Walt felt something loosen in his chest. The next generation was already learning what he'd tried so hard to demonstrate, that patience and gentleness could reach places force never could, that broken things deserved the chance to heal, that love, offered without demands, could work transformations that looked impossible from the outside. As winter began its slow retreat, as the days lengthened imperceptibly and the quality of light shifted toward the promise of spring, Walt found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't since Margaret died. He and Storm were both survivors of their own kinds of trauma, both learning to trust again after loss had taught them to close themselves off. Their healing wasn't finished. It might never be finished. But they were further along than either of them had been at that September auction, and that counted for something. Counted for everything. March arrived with the kind of weather that couldn't decide what season it belonged to. One day brought sunshine warm enough to melt the remaining snowdrifts into rushing streams of mud. The next brought freezing rain that turned everything to glass. Walt navigated these temperamental days with increasing confidence in his recovering body, though he'd learned to respect its limitations in ways his younger self never would have. Jamie came 4 times a week now, handling the heavy work while Walt focused on the subtler aspects of Storm's continued rehabilitation. The horse had changed in ways both visible and invisible. His coat had begun to shed out its winter thickness, revealing the sleek gray beneath. His eyes, once constantly vigilant for threat, had softened into something approaching peace. He moved through the corral with an ease that suggested he'd finally accepted this place as his own rather than viewing it as another temporary holding cell before the next betrayal. Most significantly, he sought out Walt's presence now rather than merely tolerating it. When Walt entered the corral each morning, Storm would lift his head from whatever he was doing and walk over, stopping just outside touching distance but clearly wanting the proximity. The Spring Stockman's exhibition was scheduled for the last weekend of April, an annual event that drew ranchers and horse enthusiasts from across 3 counties. Walt had been hearing about it for months, mostly through Ruth Kowalski, who served on the organizing committee. This year's event was generating particular buzz because Jack Holloway had arranged a demonstration of his training methods, showcasing how modern techniques could transform even difficult horses into reliable working animals in a matter of weeks. Ruth had mentioned this to Walt with a meaningful look, clearly wondering if he saw the implied challenge. Walt had dismissed the idea initially. Storm wasn't ready for public display, and Walt had no interest in proving anything to Jack Holloway or anyone else. But as March progressed and Storm continued to show remarkable progress, the idea began to germinate in Walt's mind. Not as competition with Jack, but as something else entirely. A demonstration that there was more than one way to approach a broken horse. That speed and efficiency weren't the only measures of successful training. That sometimes the slow, patient path led somewhere the fast one couldn't reach. He mentioned the possibility to Doc Peterson during one of the vet's regular visits. They were standing at the fence watching Storm roll in a patch of bare dirt, groaning with pleasure as he scratched his back. Doc listened to Walt's tentative proposal and was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Walt, I've got to ask, what's your goal here? Are you trying to prove Jack wrong? Because that's ego talking, and ego's a poor foundation for decisions involving animals." Walt shook his head. "It's not about Jack. It's about showing people that Storm came back from where he was. That what they called untameable was just traumatized. Maybe if they see it, they'll think differently next time they're ready to give up on a horse or send it to slaughter." Doc studied Walt's face with the attention of someone who'd known him for decades. "That's a good reason. But can Storm handle it? The crowds, the noise, the stress of transport and strange surroundings? All of that could undo months of progress if he gets overwhelmed." Walt had considered this extensively. "You're right, but I've been thinking we could do something small. Not a full demonstration in the main arena, just a quiet presentation in one of the side pens. Show people how he takes his grain now, how he lets me stand near him. Let them see that he's healing, even if the healing isn't finished. Maybe bring Finn along. Storm trusts Finn." Doc nodded slowly. "And what happens if Storm reacts badly? If something triggers him and he reverts?" Walt met his friend's eyes steadily. "Then people see that healing isn't linear. That setbacks happen. That's a lesson worth teaching too." The decision made, Walt began preparing in small increments. He started loading Storm's grain bucket into a wheelbarrow, getting the horse accustomed to the sound of wheels on gravel. He played recordings of crowd noise on a small radio near the corral, gradually increasing the volume over several days. He asked Jamie to invite a few friends to stand at the fence and observe, desensitizing Storm to the presence of multiple humans. Each new element was introduced carefully, with attention to Storm's stress signals. If his breathing accelerated or his eyes showed whites, they backed off and tried again the next day with less intensity. Nora was predictably skeptical when Walt told her the plan. They were sitting at his kitchen table going over his medication schedule when he brought it up. Her response was immediate and sharp. "Absolutely not. Dad, you just recovered from pneumonia. Storm's come far, but he's still unpredictable. Taking him to a crowded fairground is asking for trouble." Walt had prepared for this argument. "I'm not doing it alone. Jamie will be there. Doc Peterson agreed to come. You and Finn can be there too. We'll have support, and if Storm shows any sign of serious distress, we pack up and leave immediately. No heroics." Nora set down the pill organizer she'd been filling and looked at her father with an expression that mixed frustration and understanding. "This is important to you." Walt nodded. "More than I can properly explain. That horse was written off by everyone. Left to rot or be destroyed. Someone gave him a chance and he took it, even though every experience had taught him that humans weren't safe. If Storm can come back from that, then maybe other horses can too. Maybe other things people have given up on deserve another look." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "You're talking about more than horses." Walt reached across the table and took her hand. "Your mother used to say that healing one thing helps you understand how to heal others." Maybe she was right. The weeks leading up to the exhibition passed in a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. Storm continued to progress, allowing Walt to place a hand on his shoulder for extended periods, accepting a soft rope around his neck without panic, even taking treats directly from Walt's palm with lips so gentle they barely touched skin. These small victories accumulated like deposits in a bank account, building toward something that felt increasingly possible. Jamie proved invaluable, his young energy and natural horse sense complementing Walt's patience. Together they made a team that functioned smoothly despite the age gap. Finn spent every weekend at the ranch now, and his relationship with Storm had blossomed into something remarkable. The horse would actually approach the fence when he heard the boy's voice, would stand peacefully while Finn sang to him or read aloud from whatever book he was currently obsessed with. Children carried a different energy than adults. Nora observed one Saturday afternoon as they watched Finn demonstrate his latest song for Storm. They haven't learned fear the same way. They still believe things can be fixed. Walt smiled. Maybe that's what Storm needs. Someone who believes he can be fixed without knowing all the reasons people think he can't. 2 weeks before the exhibition, Jack Holloway's truck pulled into Walt's driveway unannounced. Walt was in the corral with Storm, simply standing together in companionable silence, when he heard the engine. Storm's head came up, ears forward and alert but not alarmed. Walt gave him a gentle pat, the gesture now familiar enough to be comfortable, and walked to the gate. Jack was climbing out of his truck, dressed in crisp jeans and a shirt that probably cost more than Walt spent on groceries in a month. "Walt," Jack called out with his practiced smile. "Got a minute to talk?" Walt latched the corral gate behind him and waited, not moving toward Jack but not retreating either. "What can I do for you, Jack?" The younger man approached, hands in his pockets, his expression carefully arranged into something meant to convey friendly concern. "I heard you might be bringing your horse to the exhibition. Wanted to talk to you about that, rancher to rancher." Walt almost smiled at the characterization. He'd never considered himself a rancher, just an old railroad man with a horse. "Go ahead." Jack glanced toward the corral where Storm stood watching them. "Look, I respect what you've done here. Getting that animal to the point where he doesn't attack on sight, that's real progress. But the exhibition is a professional venue. My demonstration is about showcasing proven training methods that produce reliable results. Having your horse there, still skittish, still unrideable, it sends the wrong message about what's possible with proper training." Walt felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "What message is that?" Jack's smile thinned slightly. "That patience alone is enough. That we should spend months or years rehabilitating dangerous horses when there are proven methods that work in weeks." Walt, the horse industry can't function on that timeline. People need horses they can use, not expensive pets that might someday be handleable. The criticism wasn't unexpected, but it still stung. Walt looked past Jack to where Storm stood, the afternoon sun turning his gray coat almost silver. What if the message isn't about timeline? What if it's about understanding what broke the horse in the first place and not repeating those mistakes? Jack's expression hardened. With respect, that's sentiment talking. I work with facts. Horses are animals, not people. They don't need therapy. They need clear boundaries, consistent discipline, and handlers who understand behavioral psychology. What you're doing with that horse is projecting your own need for redemption onto an animal that would be better served by professional intervention. The words were calculated to wound, and they succeeded. But Walt had learned something in his months with Storm about absorbing blows and remaining steady. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I am projecting. But Storm's eating peacefully, sleeping lying down, approaching humans without fear. Those are facts too. Whatever my motivations, the results speak for themselves. Jack studied him for a long moment, and something that might have been respect flickered across his face before the professional mask reasserted itself. Fair enough. I just wanted to give you a heads up that my demonstration will show a different approach. People will make comparisons. Walt nodded. That's fine. Different approaches for different situations. Not everything works for every horse. After Jack left, Walt returned to the corral and Storm immediately walked over, pushing his muzzle against Walt's chest in the gesture that had become their greeting. The horse's breath was warm and steady, his body relaxed. Walt stroked the gray neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the soft coat. We're gonna show them something, boy. Not that we're better or faster, just that there's more than one way to help someone heal. Storm blew out a breath that ruffled Walt's shirt, and Walt chose to believe it was agreement. The night before the exhibition, Walt barely slept. He lay in bed running through every possible scenario, every way things could go wrong. Storm could panic at the transport. He could become aggressive in the unfamiliar environment. He could hurt someone, proving all of Jack's warnings correct and undoing months of progress. The fears cycled through Walt's mind on repeat until he finally gave up on sleep around 4 in the morning and went to make coffee. Through the kitchen window, he could see Storm standing in the corral, his pale coat ghostly in the pre-dawn darkness. The horse was awake too, as if sensing that tomorrow would bring something significant. Jamie arrived at 6 with the borrowed trailer, an older model but solid and safe. Together they prepared Storm's temporary stall with familiar hay from his own pile, his own water bucket, everything they could think of to make the strange space more comfortable. Storm loaded with surprising ease, perhaps understanding on some level that Walt wouldn't ask him to do something dangerous. Or perhaps the trust they'd built was deep enough now that Storm was willing to try new things based solely on Walt's request. Either way, he walked into the trailer and stood calmly while Jamie secured the dividers. The drive to the fairgrounds took 40 minutes, and Walt followed in his truck with Nora and Finn. The boy chattered nervously about everything and nothing, his excitement palpable. Nora drove in tense silence, her hands tight on the wheel. Walt watched the landscape roll past and thought about Margaret, about how she would have loved this. She'd always believed in his ability to see possibilities others missed. She would have believed in Storm too. The fairgrounds appeared on the horizon, already busy despite the early hour. Trucks and trailers filled the parking areas, and the sound of generators and livestock created a constant background hum. They were assigned a small pen in the exhibition barn, away from the main arena where Jack's demonstration would take place later in the day. This suited Walt perfectly. He'd never wanted the spotlight, just the chance to show people what patience could accomplish. They unloaded Storm carefully, and the horse emerged blinking in the bright morning sun, his nostrils flaring as he took in the overwhelming sensory input. New smells, strange horses calling in the distance, diesel exhaust from tractors, fried food from vendor stalls already opening for business. Storm's body went rigid, and for a moment Walt thought they'd made a terrible mistake. Easy, Walt murmured, keeping his hand on Storm's shoulder. You're safe. I've got you. Storm's ear flicked toward his voice, and gradually the tension eased. They walked slowly to the assigned pen, Jamie leading while Walt stayed at Storm's side, providing constant reassurance through touch and voice. Once in the pen, Storm immediately retreated to the far corner, his defensive posture from those early days at Walt's place reasserting itself. Walt didn't push. He simply stood near the gate with Finn, letting Storm process the new environment at his own pace. People began to gather almost immediately. Word had spread about the untamable horse from the autumn auction, about the old man who'd taken him on despite all warnings, about the quiet work being done away from the professional training facilities. Ranchers leaned on the rail, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. A few made comments, not all of them kind, but Walt ignored them. He was focused entirely on Storm, reading the horse's body language, watching for signs that the stress was becoming too much. Doc Peterson arrived mid-morning and squeezed through the growing crowd to stand beside Walt. Quite a turnout. Walt nodded. People love a spectacle. Doc glanced at Storm, who was still pressed into his corner, but whose ears were at least rotating to track the various sounds rather than pinned flat in aggression. "How's he doing?" Walt considered the question carefully. "He's overwhelmed but managing. We'll give him more time before we try anything." Time stretched in strange ways when you were being observed by dozens of eyes. Walt was acutely aware of every whisper, every doubtful shake of a head, every person who walked away declaring the whole thing a waste. But he was more aware of Storm, of the small signs that the horse was beginning to adjust. The way his head lowered slightly, the way his breathing slowed, the way his gaze found Walt again and again, using the familiar anchor to ground himself in the chaos. Around noon, Walt made his move. He entered the pen slowly, a grain bucket in hand, and approached to within 10 feet of Storm before stopping and setting down the bucket. Then he backed away and waited. The crowd had grown larger, people having heard something was about to happen. Storm eyed the bucket, then Walt, then the pressing crowd of humans. His instinct said flee or fight. His trust in Walt said maybe, just maybe, this was safe. The battle between trauma and trust played out across his expressive face, and Walt found himself holding his breath. Storm took one step toward the bucket, then another. The crowd noise swelled slightly and Storm froze. Walt raised a hand in a gesture he'd never planned but that felt necessary, and the people around the pen actually quieted, responding to some unspoken authority in the old man's posture. In that relative silence, Storm completed his approach and lowered his head to the grain. He ate while Walt stood nearby, and then Walt did something that made the crowd gasp collectively. He walked to Storm and placed his hand on the horse's neck. Storm continued eating, accepting the touch without flinching, without fleeing. Walt stroked the gray coat, feeling the warmth of the horse beneath his palm, and spoke quietly. "You did it, boy. You showed them what brave looks like." The moment held, crystalline and perfect, before Storm finished eating and moved away to his corner. But the damage to everyone's assumptions was done. The horse they'd called Untameable had just accepted human touch in a crowded, stressful environment. It wasn't riding, wasn't working, wasn't anything that would impress professional trainers. But it was everything. The crowd dispersed slowly, many people coming to speak to Walt afterward. Some offered congratulations. Some asked questions about his methods. A few admitted they had difficult horses they'd been ready to give up on and wanted to know if patience might work where force had failed. Walt answered what he could, but his attention kept returning to Storm, making sure the horse was coping with the ongoing stimulation. Jamie stayed near the pen, running interference with the more aggressive questioners, giving Storm space. Jack Holloway's demonstration was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in the main arena. Walt had no intention of watching, but Nora convinced him they should at least observe for a few minutes. They left Jamie with Storm and made their way to the grandstand where several hundred people had gathered. Jack entered the arena on a magnificent chestnut mare, his posture perfect, his equipment gleaming. The horse responded to his every cue with precision, demonstrating advanced maneuvers that drew appreciative applause from the knowledgeable crowd. Jack was good at what he did. That was undeniable. The demonstration progressed through various scenarios, showing how quickly a horse could be taught complex behaviors through his systematic approach. Jack narrated throughout, explaining the psychology behind each technique, the importance of timing and consistency, the way pressure and release could shape behavior efficiently. It was impressive, educational, and completely validated his philosophy that horses were trainable animals requiring skilled handling rather than emotional connection. The crowd loved it. They applauded enthusiastically as Jack completed his program and took a bow from the saddle. As Jack exited the arena, he caught sight of Walt in the stands. For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not hostility exactly, but recognition of their fundamental difference in approach. Jack nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that both methods existed even if he believed his was superior. Walt nodded back, offering the same respect. They would never agree on philosophy, but they could acknowledge each other's dedication to the animals in their care. Back at Storm's pen, the afternoon was winding down and the crowds were thinning as people headed home or toward the evening festivities. Storm had weathered the day better than Walt had dared hope, and now stood in his pen looking tired but calm. Finn had fallen asleep in a chair someone had brought, exhausted by the excitement. Nora sat beside him, her expression softer than it had been in months. Doc Peterson was talking to a young couple about their mare who had developed fear issues after a trailer accident. Walt stood at the fence with his hand on Storm's pen, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint everything gold. They hadn't won any ribbons. They hadn't impressed the professional trainers. They hadn't proven that their method was better or faster or more efficient than anyone else's. But they had shown something important. That horses written off as dangerous might just be desperately afraid. That time and patience could rebuild what force had broken. That healing happened on its own schedule and couldn't be rushed without risk of further damage. These lessons wouldn't make headlines or change industry standards overnight. But maybe someone would remember. Maybe the next time they encountered a difficult horse, they'd pause before reaching for harsher methods. Maybe they'd wonder if patient gentleness might work where aggression had failed. Ruth Kowalski found Walt as they were preparing to load Storm for the trip home. She approached with her characteristic directness, her lined face reflecting something that might have been approval. "Walt Brennan, I've known you 40 years and you still surprise me. That was something special you showed folks today. Not flashy, but real." Walt smiled, feeling the deep exhaustion of the long day settling into his bones. "We just showed up, Ruth. Storm did the rest." She patted his arm, and the gesture carried decades of friendship. Sometimes showing up is the hardest part. You take care of that horse. And yourself. Both of you earned your rest. The drive home was quiet, everyone too tired for conversation. Storm loaded easily this time, as if understanding they were heading back to his safe place. At the ranch, they unloaded him into his corral and he immediately went to his favorite corner, lowering himself to the ground with a groan of relief. Walt stood watching him for a long moment, Jamie beside him. The young man spoke softly, his voice carrying wonder. "Mr. Brennan, do you think Storm knows what he did today?" Walt considered the question. "I think he knows he survived something hard and came out the other side. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything." That night, Walt sat on his porch wrapped in a blanket against the spring chill, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. Through the darkness he could see Storm's pale form in the corral, the horse resting but alert, always maintaining that awareness that trauma teaches. They were alike in that way, Walt thought, both carrying wounds that had shaped them, both learning slowly that the world held kindness as well as cruelty, both discovering that trust could be rebuilt even after it had been shattered into pieces too small to count. Margaret's absence still ached, would always ache, but it felt different now. Less like an open wound and more like an old scar that pulled sometimes but had healed enough to live with. She would have been proud of what he'd done with Storm, not because it was impressive by any standard measure, but because it was kind. Because he'd seen a creature in pain and chosen to help rather than walk away. Because he'd been willing to learn that his own healing was tied up somehow with Storm's. That in saving this broken horse he'd been finding his way back to himself. The stars emerged one by one, familiar constellations wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns. Walt thought about time, about how much of it he might have left, about how he wanted to spend whatever remained. Not proving anything to anyone, not chasing accomplishments or recognition, just this. Sitting in the quiet with a horse who'd learned to trust him standing watch nearby. Knowing his daughter was safe in town with his grandson sleeping peacefully. Having helped one broken thing become a little less broken. It wasn't the life he'd imagined when he was young and thought he had time for everything. But it was a good life, an honest life, and it was enough. Storm lifted his head as if sensing Walt's thoughts across the distance between them. Their eyes met in the darkness, horse and man, survivor and survivor. Then Storm lowered his head again and Walt drained the last of his cold tea and went inside to sleep the deep dreamless sleep of the truly tired. Tomorrow would bring more work, more small steps forward, maybe some steps back. But that was fine. They had time. Not forever, but enough. And they would use it well, teaching each other daily about courage and patience and the stubborn grace of healing. The story wasn't finished. Stories like there's never really finished. They just continued, one quiet day at a time, building something that mattered precisely because it was built slowly, carefully, with attention to what was needed rather than what would impress. And in that continuance was all the victory they needed. Summer arrived in Iron Ridge with the kind of heat that shimmered off the pavement and turned the prairie grass golden. Walt's daily routine with Storm had settled into something that felt less like work and more like partnership. The horse no longer retreated when Walt entered the corral. Instead, he would lift his head and walk over, accepting the gentle stroke on his neck as his due. They had reached an understanding that went beyond training or rehabilitation. They had become companions, two souls who'd found each other when both needed saving. Jamie had proven himself invaluable, and Walt had increased his hours and his pay from the modest income that was now trickling in from visitors. Word of Storm's transformation had spread through the ranching community, and people began showing up at Walt's property asking if they could see the untamable horse that had learned to trust. Walt charged nothing for these visits, but many left donations in the coffee can he'd reluctantly placed by the gate at Nora's insistence. It wasn't much, but it helped with feed costs and gave Storm's story a practical purpose beyond the emotional one. The real change came when a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Vasquez contacted Walt through the county extension office. She was an equine psychologist from the state university, researching trauma recovery in horses, and she'd heard about Storm's case. Could she visit and document his progress? Walt was skeptical of academic attention, worried it might turn Storm into a specimen rather than recognizing him as an individual, but Doc Peterson vouched for Dr. Vasquez's integrity. She arrived on a blazing afternoon in early July, a compact woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that assessed Storm with professional interest tempered by genuine compassion. Walt showed her Storm's progression through the months, the notes he'd kept in a battered journal at Margaret's old suggestion to track anything important. Dr. Vasquez read through them with increasing fascination, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood not just horse behavior but the human side of the equation. What struck her most, she told Walt as they stood watching Storm graze peacefully in the afternoon sun, was the absence of dominance-based techniques. You never tried to break him further, she observed. You just waited for him to decide he was ready to be whole again. That observation led to something Walt hadn't anticipated. Dr. Vasquez asked if she could bring students to observe Storm, to learn about trauma-informed approaches to horse rehabilitation. She offered to pay for the privilege, enough to cover Storm's expenses for months. Walt discussed it with Storm in the way he'd gotten used to, standing in the corral speaking his thoughts aloud while the horse listened with swiveling ears. What do you think, boy? Ready to be a teacher? Storm had pushed his nose into Walt's chest, which Walt chose to interpret as agreement. The first student group arrived in August, 6 young people pursuing degrees in animal science and veterinary medicine. They sat on hay bales outside the corral while Dr. Vasquez explained Storm's history, and Walt demonstrated the subtle communication that had developed between them. He showed how Storm would approach when called with a specific whistle, how he would accept a halter now though Walt rarely used one, how he could be led around the property on nothing but trust and a loose rope. The students asked thoughtful questions, and Walt found himself articulating things he'd learned instinctively but had never put into words. One student, A quiet young woman named Andrea stayed after the others left. She confessed that she had a horse at home, a mare traumatized by a barn fire, who wouldn't let anyone near her anymore. Her parents wanted to sell the mare, but Andrea couldn't bear the thought. Could Walt's methods work for her situation? Walt considered carefully before answering. Every horse is different, he said. What worked for Storm might not work exactly the same way for your mare. But the principles stay constant. Patience, respect for their fear, willingness to let them set the pace. Give her time and space and see what happens. Months later, Andrea would send a letter with photos of her mare, calm and healthy, accepting human touch again. The letter would join others in a box Walt kept on his kitchen counter. Testimonials to the ripple effect of one old man's decision to save one broken horse. But that August day, he simply offered what wisdom he could and watched the young woman drive away with hope rekindling in her eyes. Finn spent most of his summer break at the ranch, and his bond with Storm had deepened into something remarkable. The horse would rest his head on the fence rail while the boy read aloud, would follow Finn around the corral like a giant patient dog, would stand perfectly still when Finn wanted to practice the braiding techniques he'd learned from YouTube videos. Nora watched these interactions with a mother's protective concern gradually giving way to acceptance. Her father and her son had found something meaningful here, something that fed parts of them she hadn't known were hungry. One evening in late September, as the heat finally broke and the first cool winds hinted at autumn's return, Nora helped Walt prepare dinner in the kitchen that still held Margaret's presence in every corner. She was quieter than usual, and Walt recognized the signs of something weighing on her mind. Finally, as they sat down to eat, she spoke. "Dad, I've been thinking about something. What if we made this official? What if we turned this place into a proper rescue and rehabilitation center for traumatized horses?" Walt set down his fork, genuinely surprised. "That would take resources we don't have." Nora nodded, ready for this objection. "I've been researching grants for agricultural education and animal welfare. Dr. Vasquez thinks she could help us apply. We'd need to make some improvements to the property, maybe build another shelter, but it's possible. And Jamie's interested in making this his career. He's talking about studying equine therapy in college. We could build something real here, Dad. Something that lasts beyond just Storm." The idea settled into Walt's mind like seeds finding soil. Margaret had always wanted the property to serve a larger purpose. She talked about opening it to 4-H kids or starting a community garden or creating something that gave back to Iron Ridge. This felt like a fulfillment of that old dream, transformed by circumstance into something neither of them could have imagined. "What does Storm think?" Walt asked, only half joking. Nora smiled. "Why don't we ask him?" They walked out to the corral together, father and daughter, and Storm raised his head from his evening hay to watch their approach. The setting sun turned his gray coat to rose gold, and his eyes held that gentle awareness that still sometimes caught Walt by surprise. This horse that had been so broken, so convinced that humans meant pain, now stood peacefully in the presence of people who loved him. If that transformation was possible, then maybe other transformations were too. Maybe healing could become not just a personal journey but a shared mission. The rescue center became reality slowly, the way all worthwhile things seem to in Walt's experience. Grants were written and revised and submitted. Some were rejected, but enough were approved to begin improvements. A second shelter went up by November, built partially by volunteers from the community who'd been moved by Storm's story. Jamie graduated high school that spring and enrolled in a specialized program in equine therapy, working at the ranch between classes. By the following summer, they took in their first rescue, a bay mare who'd been seized from a neglect situation. Storm watched the new arrival with interest but no aggression, as if understanding she was struggling with demons similar to his own. Walt applied the same patient approach, and though the mare's journey was different from Storm's, the principles held true. Time, consistency, gentle persistence, and respect for trauma's timeline. Dr. Vasquez brought more students, and the ranch became a teaching site where young people learned that force wasn't the only path to training, that sometimes the strongest tool was simply witnessing an animal's pain and offering safety until they could believe in it. Walt's health had its ups and downs, His knee still protested cold mornings and his energy wasn't what it once was. But he'd learned to work within his limitations. He'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. Jamie handled the physical demands while Walt provided the knowledge and intuition that came from his months with Storm. Together they made a team that served the horses well. 2 years after that September auction, on a morning when frost silvered the grass and the air smelled of wood smoke and changing seasons, Walt stood in the corral with Storm and realized something profound. He'd spent so long thinking he was saving this horse, giving Storm a chance at a better life. But the truth was more complex and more beautiful. They had saved each other. Storm had given Walt a reason to keep living after Margaret's death had left him hollow. Had taught him that broken things could heal if given patience and care. Had shown him that his remaining years could hold purpose and meaning beyond simply existing until the end arrived. Storm lowered his head and Walt rested his forehead against the broad face, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and hay and home. "Thank you," Walt whispered, "for trusting me when you had every reason not to. For teaching an old man that it's never too late to start over." Storm's breath warmed Walt's hands, steady and calm, the breath of an animal at peace. The Iron Ridge Equine Rescue and Rehabilitation Center would grow over the coming years, helping dozens of horses find their way back from trauma. Jamie would eventually take over daily operations while pursuing his degree, and young Andrea would return after graduation to join the team, bringing her own mare to serve as a calm presence for new arrivals. Finn would spend his teenage years learning patience and compassion through work with damaged horses, lessons that would shape the man he'd become. Nora would finally find peace with her father's choices, recognizing that his work with Storm had been about healing grief as much as healing horses. But on that frost-touched morning, none of that future was visible. There was only an old man and a gray horse standing together in the quiet dawn, two survivors who'd found each other when both needed saving most. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and warming the earth. Storm moved away to investigate his breakfast hay, and Walt watched him with the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing he'd done something that mattered. Not something grand or publicly celebrated, but something true. He'd looked at a creature everyone else had written off and seen possibility. He'd offered patience when the world demanded quick results. He'd proven that gentleness could triumph where force had failed. The rescue center's sign would eventually hang by the road, visible to passing traffic. But the real memorial to what had happened here would remain invisible to most eyes. It lived in Storm's calm gaze, in the way traumatized horses gradually learned to trust again, in the students who carried these lessons into their careers, in the quiet revolution of understanding that healing couldn't be rushed and broken things deserved time to become whole. Walt Brennan, retired railroad man, hadn't set out to change anything beyond one horse's life. But sometimes the smallest acts of compassion ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, touching lives and changing perspectives in expanding circles that reach further than any single person could imagine. And so the work continued, season after season, horse after horse, each one teaching something new while the fundamental truths remained constant. Patience, respect, the willingness to meet trauma with gentleness rather than force. The faith that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. These lessons, learned first between an old man and an untamable horse, would echo forward through years and lives. A quiet legacy built on the simple revolutionary act of refusing to give up on something broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.